Alrighty, so I'd like to get started on 6 ways to improve workforce quality and efficiency. So that's kind of I've been with VPI for 11 years. That's the world I live in, the world we live in as an organization. And I won't get in too much into Next Gen 911 because Fletch covered it in great detail. But typically, the way we're basically as a recording system solutions provider, what we do, we're like a catcher's mitt. We catch everything that comes in to your communication center, right? So if you look at all the forms of media that are going to be coming into our communication center over the next few years, and in some agencies this information is already coming in, right? Text messaging, things like that. There's really 2 types. There's audio and text, and there's also video as well. So we record basically the audio, the video, as well as text messaging, all different forms, chat, email. Not as big in public safety yet, but text messaging is kind of the next step, if you will. So first best practice is to build a foundation for success. What does that mean, right? So you have your analog, typically your analog and your digital recording. That's probably what most of you guys are using right now. Does everyone here use a recording system? You guys all have a recording system? All right, so you're basically recording analog radios, digital phones perhaps. Maybe you're starting to migrate towards IP radio. We're starting to see more of that. IP phones, you know, a lot of our customers, we have a lot of joint customers with Avaya and with Avtech, and it's IP traffic essentially that you're recording. So that's kind of the next step. Make sure whatever system you're looking at is able to record P25 radio, voice over IP, which is basically just communications all going over the internet or a secure network. And then next generation 911 gets into what's called SIP recording. The beauty of that is everything, whether it's audio, video, text, data, it's all in a single SIP packet. And that SIP protocol allows any vendor in any type of technology, whether it's recording systems, communication systems, CAD systems, to speak the same language, because it's all coming in the exact same form. And that's the beauty of Next Generation 911, is if you have the technology to actually grab it, look at it, it's all coming in the same format. And Fletch didn't get into it too much today, but it's called PITAFLOW. It's a little packet, that's just the acronym, that all this information comes in, and it has a header, and it tells you exactly what's in that packet of information that you're gathering. So the way it works from a recording standpoint is you have a legacy endpoint, any form of media, whether you're on your mobile phone, headset, you're on a laptop, however you're calling in 911, it basically looks at a validation server, and then it converts everything to this SIP signaling protocol. So all of this, whatever type of communications you had from the start, it's converting it all into SIP, into this one kind of packet with everything in it. And it has what's called a SIP header, and that allows us to read what's in there. That SIP header, from a recording system standpoint, it has an invite that tells us to start recording, and then it has what's called a buy event. It tells us to stop recording. As Fletch showed in that cloud, right, where we're now pulling, when you're getting a call, you're actually just being pulled into this conference bridge, right? You guys saw that big cloud. We're now getting pulled in, call comes in, I pick up, I'm getting pulled into this bridge. So what's happening is recording systems are going in the ESI net. So as counties build out these ESI nets, PSEPs build out ESI nets, states are starting to do it now. Some states decide they want to do a state one first and then, have everyone join the state one. Some counties aren't waiting. They're building theirs out first. There's recording systems at the ESI net, which record everything. But there's also recording systems still at the local agency. So people say, oh, does that mean I don't need a recording system? It doesn't. You still typically have a recording system at your location that's going to, anytime you get invited to that bridge, you're now gaining access. You're still recording those conversations. So we're just looking for kind of that SIP invite to start recording and that buy event to stop recording. Once you get invited into this conference bridge, you now have access to the entire scenario. So even if you only get pulled in at the end, right, you're kind of the last one to get pulled in, you still have the entire recording, the entire scenario, not just the part where you were involved in, which is nice. So what are the requirements from, in this, Fletch mentioned, there's this NINA standards document. It came out in November. These are the requirements for the recording section. So you have, it must be open standards, and this is for any technology, any NG911 technology. Open standards, open hardware, software. Actively record audio, video, and real-time text all within the same system. And that's what we just went to Chicago recently. We did what's called a NINA ICE 8 testing event, where we went and made sure that we're able to capture all these different forms of media. Collect data, attributes from the ESINet, CAD, and case processing systems, and I'll talk in a little bit of what that means, why it's important to collect that data and tag it to your recordings as well. Then record and track transferred calls. That's a big one. So what's nice is with this conference bridge, when you transfer, you're just pulling in another party into it. So it makes it a lot easier from our standpoint to track and record these transferred calls, because you're really just recording that same session, if you will. You're just bringing in a new party when you transfer them. You're not really transferring the entire thing, and you can leave that bridge, but we're just recording that conference session, if you will. And then securely authenticate voice and data. So that's just security procedures that are in place. So those are the things you want to look at from a recording perspective. So I talked a little bit about tagging CAD data to calls, and you can do this now. So it's very valuable to have additional data tagged to your recordings. So right now maybe you're getting the date, the time of the call, caller ID, anti-alley information, right? So you're getting some very limited data with your call recording system, and that's what makes trying to find calls, radio traffic. How many of you ever try to put together a scenario, like pulled calls, right? If you've done that, it takes a lot of time to find ones related to that scenario. But imagine you just tagged the CAD data from the CAD system to all your call recordings, right? So you now have incident ID, the incident type, the severity, the location, all that information tagged to your recordings. Wouldn't it be nice to just search by incident ID, pull up everything related to that? Or wouldn't it be nice? Question?
Will that work when you operate with call takers and dispatchers?
Yeah, so if you have call takers and dispatchers, anything that shows up in the CAD system, basically what we do is just look at a copy of the CAD database. They don't always want you interfacing directly with the CAD system. They make a copy. Then as the calls come in, we just pull that data, tag it to the recordings. So anything that shows up while they're actually handling the call, whether it's a call taker or dispatcher, can be tagged to the recordings. Notes. All that data becomes searchable. So you'll see down here, it's actually tagged to the call recording, the media player. In this case, it was incident number this, it was a high severity, status is in progress, it was an overdose. All that data you can use for searching, and even more importantly, as we get more into quality assurance, you can use that to identify the high priority types of calls that you want to evaluate. So just imagine if you now could search by anything in the CAD system, which is kind of what we do anyways, right? We go into the CAD system, we look for information related to this event, then we go back into the recording system, and we try to find the calls and the radio traffic related to that. Well, you can automate the tagging of all that CAD information to the calls, so you can search on all that, even notes, anything you want can be tagged to the call. So that's a second best practice. So quality assurance standards, this is really getting big. The amount of traffic, I'm very active with APCO and NINA. How many are familiar with the APCO online forum? You guys get it in your inbox, right? There's almost weekly conversations on quality assurance, on other things too, but quality assurance is a really hot one right now. So the NFPA has some current quality assurance standards that are out there. National Center of Missing and Exploited Children also requires quality assurance on those types of communications that involve missing or exploited children. But the big one is the new APCO NINA standard that just came out. It was out at the end of May. They published it for comments, which we provided a lot of feedback. It's a long document. And what I'll do is I'll send you guys like the 1.5-page cliff notes. We wrote a blog just on what does this really mean. So you don't have to go read the whole thing, but if you just want to see what are the main things that they're saying you should be doing from a quality assurance perspective, we'll include that in the follow-up as well. But they closed it for comments just recently, and so now they're kind of finalizing it, so it should be out soon. It's not mandatory, but it is a great guideline on how we should be conducting quality assurance and training, quality improvement within our PSAPs. So the big one, and the one that we continue to get a lot of questions, I had a lady call me from a large PSAP in New York yesterday, and she says, we take 4,000 calls a day. She says, I see that we're supposed to be evaluating 2% of all calls and 100% of all catastrophic losses and high priority incidents. How are we supposed to do that, right? How are we going to do that? And if you're manually doing it and you're manually trying to find all those, you could be there for weeks just trying to find them, right? And you have to do it with ASAP or within 5 days. But if you're tagging CAD data to your calls, that becomes a lot easier. So, by the way, I wanted to thank the committee that's putting this together, but Fletch is on that as well. So as I'm scrolling through, I see his name. He's everywhere. But thanks for your help with this. I know he reviewed it and provided a lot of great feedback on it as well. So it's a great document that'll be coming out shortly. But what it does is it basically...
That's a joint NINA-APCO document, so it really covers the whole industry, and there's a lot of input that went into this.
Yeah, it's a fantastic document, and thanks to everyone who helped out with that. And I know, hundreds of people have provided feedback and best practices. And really, one of the key things is, right now, a lot of us we're queuing EMD calls, right? Because that's, maybe 7 EMD calls or 7%, whatever it is, right? And does that sound familiar to everyone? Like we do the EMD calls, but maybe not police, fire, other types of calls. That's pretty common, right? So the problem with that is the public expects more than that. The public expects that, every type of emergency is important, not just medical emergencies, right? So that's why when you see, you should do 2% of all calls, right? Whether it's EMD or not, we need to start thinking that way, not just kind of, we've been doing EMD calls forever. How do we get beyond that as an agency? And there's some workflow that can definitely help with that. So the automated workflow, once you have this data tagged to your recordings, whether it's CAD data, even just, that 2% of all calls, modern QA system will allow you to basically set a business rule up saying, send 2% of every call to their supervisor to evaluate, and they have to evaluate it within 5 days. Give it a due date of 5 days ahead. and you get a to-do list. This to-do list, believe it or not, is a huge time saver. So think about the time it takes to find the calls you'd want to evaluate. Even if it's just a random 2% of calls, it's not really that random. You're kind of hunting and pecking, hoping to find calls maybe between 3 and 7 minutes in length, whatever. But you spend a lot of time going in there. I spoke with one lady. She said it took her 2 weeks every month just to find the calls because they're trying to achieve this type of quantity of volume. 2 weeks just to find the calls to evaluate and assign them. She said once they got the to-do list, she's like, it's all automated. I don't have to do any of that. All we do is just evaluate calls. Another lady in Bell County, Texas, she's able to do over 1,000 evaluations a month now. They do 8 or 9 per call taker and dispatcher per month, and they have 60-some people doing that role. And she's just pounding them out because it's already scheduling them for her, right? So that to-do list is a huge thing. So it could be 2% of all calls, just randomly. And you can also say, I want 100% of these types of high priority incidents, because you now have the CAD data tagged your calls. So maybe it's, those are different among different agencies, but, domestic violence, missing, children, missing person, 4-alarm, fires, whatever is important to your agency, cardiac arrest, whatever it is, you can automatically schedule 100%, or maybe you want to start with just a sample, right? So the NINA APCO it's a guideline of where you want to get to, but you can start even with a sample of high priority incidents. But you could schedule 100% automatically. Then what happens is QA form pops up. So if you're using Excel now or paper forms, we just put those into the software. In fact, we've even built out all the forms. There's some really nice example forms in that standards draft. And we actually just build them in our software. I said, I'm just going to go put them in there. They're all in there. So you can it'll pull up the one related to that type of call automatically. Another thing that's getting bigger and bigger is screen recording. So why not just, we can record audio, but why not record the screens as well? So you can see all the different, the mapping screen, the console screens, the CAD screens. All that shows up so you can see when you're actually reviewing for quality, you can see it's not always maybe something they said. It's maybe they're navigating, it's tough to navigate through certain systems. You mentioned that there's so many different systems that it could take a year to get up to speed for someone new coming in, right? So having good example calls where they can actually see how other dispatchers and call takers are navigating through properly and what they're doing on certain circumstances. That's a real value add in training. It also helps when you're doing coaching. They get to see what they're doing as they're listening to the audio.
Actually, a real quick comment. So from the commercial contact center space, one thing that we learned from there was a large retail contact center was saying, I've got poor levels of service, customer service. And people were saying, well, that's because I'm having problems with the online systems. And they were listening to the audio recordings, and what they were hearing was the call taker saying, 1 second, the computer is slow, I'm having a problem. And what they found by recording the screens was it wasn't that they were having problems, it's that they didn't know how to operate the system properly.
Yeah.
And they were using that, oh, the computer is slow, oh, the computer isn't responding. And they were using that basically as an excuse. And it wasn't until they started doing screen recording that they found out it was really a user problem. So this is critical.
Yeah, that's a great point. It doesn't add much more cost to the recording system. You're just basically saying, all right, we want to record these 2 monitors or these 3 monitors in addition to the audio, and then you play it back, you see the screen recording as well. And it's very high quality, which is nice, so you can see all the detail. Usually people put it off onto a second monitor when they're evaluating calls so they can see the screens. So another way, we're always looking at ways, and how can we automate workflow, right? Because that's the key. So does anyone use Priority Dispatch? You guys use Priority Dispatch? So if you use, the Aqua software, basically, what we did is we work with them closely. They have a team of individuals at Priority Dispatch that does quality assurance for agencies that don't have the time to evaluate all those interactions themselves. So we work with them. We have a lot of joint customers, and we said, hey, if we could speed up your workflow, because they were in this Priority Dispatch QA software, and then they're having to go to the separate recording system to find those calls, pull them up. So we just created a call playback button within their software that automatically it already knows what case they're on, what incident. Click the button, it pulls up the call, the screen video, plays it. It sped up their time to do evaluations by over 50%. The next thing we're doing is just adding markers. So there's 6 markers they wanted that they want to jump to. And so we're tagging those from the CAD system on the actual timeline of the call, to where they can just jump ahead, did they do this, jump ahead, did they do this, this, and this. So you don't have to listen to the entire conversation. So we're always looking at ways to do this. One of them, so we realized, people do have existing QA software. We integrate the recordings into those, or they could use our software to do the QA as well, if they're not already using something. So another important part to QA is the timeliness. So if you look at the standard saying, you should really do quality assurance as soon as possible, or at least within 5 days of that, because after that, they already forgot about it. They're not going to remember when you go back and train them on it. I mean, usually after a day or two, it's already kind of forgotten about. So we look at ways of how can we automate feedback to the call takers and dispatchers. So as soon as an evaluation is completed, they have access to that. They can listen to it. They can see what their scores are. They can give feedback back, if they can dispute it. But when that coaching session actually happens, it's not just like this score they get and they don't listen to anything after they saw the score, right? So it's they already know. They know usually what they did wrong. We had one public safety agency, they had a couple extra computers in the IT department, and they just moved them into the lunchroom. They allowed the call takers and dispatchers to evaluate themselves. 2 things happened was the sign-up sheet was always full, and they actually scored themselves harder than their supervisors did. So you've heard yourself, right? You're pretty harsh on yourself, and some agencies do peer-to-peer monitoring as well, where the feedback from peers actually is received better than the feedback from supervisors in some cases, right? So just ways to think about. These up top are tickers. So the way QA forms are typically, they're segmented out, so you can see your score for each of the segment for the last 30 days. You can see your most recent score. You can click on that and listen to that call, view it. So you have access to speed of answer information, time to dispatch. Whatever's important you can put into these tickers, and these are always on. They're typically on one of the side monitors, not one of the main CAD screens, but always looking at ways to provide more timely feedback to call takers and dispatchers. So ongoing coaching is also a big one. So feedback is a mechanism of coaching, right? Providing reminders, but just paying attention. So the Hawthorne effect is a study that was done outside of Chicago in a manufacturing plant. And they didn't manufacture light bulbs, but what they did is they did a study where they just started changing the room lighting, different up and then down. Every time they did something, they experienced a productivity improvement for a short while. And so then all of a sudden they started changing the office configuration, and they kept seeing productivity improvements. And the net of it all was, if you just pay attention to your employees, provide feedback, do something different, they know you're kind of watching, you're being there, you start to see productivity improvements. And that's the same thing we see with quality assurance, and it plays really big into what we talked about this morning with retention, right? It's not always the pay. You know, pay is a big part, obviously, right? That's a lot of times while we work, but if you have that constant feedback, the constant coaching, you feel like you're helping people out, you know, you're getting better at what you do, you can retain employees at a lower pay rate than other agencies. So just how do you think about your agency today? How could you improve feedback and coaching on an ongoing basis? Even, you know, it doesn't always require tools. Tools are there to help, but a lot of it is just the way we think about coaching and training. So some best practices. These are things you could probably implement pretty quick. Allow call takers and dispatchers to flag their own calls or identify their own calls that they want coaching on without scoring. You're not going to evaluate it. You're not going to grade it. But hey, this is something, you know, maybe I had a hard time on this one, or I didn't understand something. I'd like to talk about this during our next coaching session. We've also seen just recently with the Winter Olympics, one PSAP that, you know, they talked about doing a Winter Olympics where they allowed them to tag their own calls and submit them for a contest. So they had different categories, so all the different types of incidents. They even had a category for funniest call, you know, all the incidents. They created a gold, a silver, and a bronze. It didn't really cost them too much of anything. What it did is allowed them to submit these calls for those categories, you know, for the different incident types. And at the end, they had like a little ceremony, and they basically, you know, gave out little medals. They weren't very expensive for gold, silver, and bronze for all these. And then they ended up getting a really great training library of calls of the best types of how to handle all these different circumstances and situations. Another one did it around the Academy Awards, so you create categories and same kind of thing, right? But just a great, low-cost, inexpensive way to not only, it gets them to buy into the whole recording and quality assurance process, but also gives you a great training library for ongoing coaching and even initial training as well. So the last tip is leveraging speech and text analytics. And again, this application has been around in commercial contact centers for over 10 years, and we're just starting to see more and more uses within public safety agencies. So essentially what speech and text does, or we'll start with speech, it just translates all of the audio into text so you can search it. So CAD data is a great starting place, right? Let's tag as much CAD data as we have. But there's certain things that are said within conversations that aren't always captured in the CAD system, right? A lot of non-emergency type calls, you know, not all that, you might capture the first one in the CAD system, right, a noise complaint, but how many times you put the second and the third and the fourth, you don't really know exactly, can't quantify that as well. Even with emergencies, it doesn't if there's a traffic accident, it doesn't always get tagged to that same incident. So what speech analytics allows you to do is basically mine the audio, and I'll give you an example. So first you tag the CAD data to the interactions, then you basically translate that into a transcript. And it's not something you sit there and read. It's not like a word-for-word transcript. It's one that allows the system to identify, when you're searching for this phrase, missing person or officer down or officer involved, it allows the system to find that recording where that phrase was in. And then there's rules that you can say, all right, like our system, we have out-of-the-box categories for a host of, you know, hazardous materials and, you know, a host of the major incident types, the higher priority incident types, you know, domestic violence, things like this, to where as soon as you plug the speech analytics in, any call that comes in that had those keywords that were in that category get bucketed into those categories automatically. So you can start to see trending over time on what's happening, what kind of new phrases are popping up, that you might not be aware of, things like that. So here's just a case study. So here down in Pennsylvania, there was a string of porch fires, and they just said, all right, give me all the calls where porch and fire was in the same call within this many words. Because you put in, within 10 words, within 5 words, and you can kind of narrow down. But they found that there was a number of addresses that had similar crimes, and they were able to listen to those recordings and actually, they were actually able to charge the suspects based on that evidence. But they didn't have that before. So it's really good for improving investigations and so forth. That's just one example. It's also good for script compliance. Are they asking the right questions in the right order, right? So you think about, I know with priority dispatch, like if you don't get the first 7 questions right, you could be totally off base and you're going down the wrong line of questioning. So what if you just monitor the first 7 questions and make sure they were saying those in the right order, right? That'll give you an idea, hey, we don't think this one was, I think you should listen to this call. It doesn't seem to be in the right order. That's another use for speech and text analytics tools. And then you can set up alerts. So probably want to keep these somewhat limited, but there's some examples. Maybe there are certain phrases you don't want to hear, certain ones that if you hear them, you want to be notified. Shots fired, even positive ones, right? We set up categories for customer service, right? We want to know when someone was empathetic and provide, encouraging feedback when the caller was in distress. We want to hear that the call taker responded appropriately, or someone says something very positive about the experience. We want to highlight that and share that with the team. It's not always just the negative things as well. A lot of people do. They look at like 10 codes. You typically have different 10 codes for the field for different meanings. They're not always the same across agencies, but you could look for those. Maybe certain 10 codes are more important to you, and you want to know in the when they're saying this 10 code versus another 10 code, or maybe one is an arrival code that you want to hear, and you want to check how many people are giving that code when they're on scene, things like that. Any questions about what I covered? Quality assurance, kind of how to automate as much as you can so you're not hunting and pecking for calls to listen to. That's where the big time killer is, and that'll, a lot of it is we don't have the resources to do that many calls, but if you're manually doing it, you'll never have enough resources. So you have to try to automate as much as you can. And then the speech analytics allows you to dive deeper into investigations and search on audio of those recordings as well. All right, well, thank you for your time. Really appreciate it.